introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'm Erik and I pastor the Journey Church, which is here in town. I'm actually born and raised in Lebanon, so this is where I'm from. Believe it or not, I never thought I would stay here. I always thought I would get out of this town the second I graduated, and I actually did do that. I went to the Army. I was gone for 4 years, and I thought, I'm going to stay in the Army. I loved it. I loved the camaraderie. I loved the travel. I loved being away. And then I started dating who would become my wife, a girl that was still here in town. In fact, she was going to Cumberland, and I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we started dating, and it started getting more serious, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to end up getting out of the Army and going back to Lebanon is what's going to happen. And that's what did happen. And so it wasn't in my plans to be back in Lebanon. I didn't grow up going to church, except for when I spent the night with my grandmother. My grandmother was a faithful Christian. She went to church. So if I spent the night with her on Saturdays, I would attend Sunday school and go to church with her on Sundays. And then, but my parents didn't go to church. So when I was gone in the Army, by the time I was a teenager, I stopped going with my grandma. It wasn't cool to spend the night with your grandma on Saturday nights. I was doing other things. And so I fell away from church for years. And when I was in the Army, my wife actually started going to a church and got saved, became a Christian, was baptized. And she called me one Sunday. It was like, hey, I became a Christian and I'm getting baptized. And I was like, oh, that's cool. You know, I knew about that stuff when I was a kid and stuff too. You know, like I thought I was really kind of connecting with her. Like, yeah, I've done that before. And it really began to kind of change who she was. It really began to change her life. And I started to kind of take notice of that. Long story short, it began a process of my own investigation of where am I spiritually? What do I believe? What am I giving my life to? And that led me down a course of eventually making my own faith profession and becoming a Christian. And then what began to happen was as I became a Christian and I studied the Bible, I wanted other people that I grew up with in this area who thought they understood it, because around here everybody's a Christian, right? We just call it cultural Christianity. Everybody's a Christian because granddad was a deacon, you know, they said the Lord's Prayer before football games, you know, just all the things. And what I began to discover is that they actually didn't understand at all what was taught in the Bible. They didn't know at all what it looked like to walk with God, have a relationship with God. And so at 21 years old, 22 years old, no training, no formal education in doing it, I just started trying to help get my friends in a Bible study and walk through those things with them. And what began as just a few people in our living room, because my wife and I ended up getting married, just continued to grow. And eventually I began to feel called into ministry, and that eventually down the road led to the starting of the Journey Church over 15 years ago. It was in the summer of 2005 that we first started meeting, and it was January 2006 that we started. And so that's how I ended up getting to be a pastor. It was not on my life, goals to be a pastor. If somebody would have asked me, you think you'll be a pastor when you get older? I would have laughed and been like, no. I mean, why would I do that for? Who would want to be a pastor? Because I just had all these images in my mind of what that meant, and I didn't feel like I fit any of that, right? I thought it meant I had to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, eat fried chicken exclusively on Sundays, like I just had all these weird ideas of like, this is what pastors do, this is how pastors talk, and I'm not that. And so I ran from that for a while, but eventually found myself in my hometown, which I never thought I would be, planting and pastoring a church, which I never thought I would do. And 15, 16 years later now, I say, wow, here I am. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of background about me coming to faith and even how I got into ministry. Now, are you wanting me to go into some other details?
Well, let me, I can relate to your story. I went to theology school, not to be a pastor. I had gone through in college, I guess a kind of crisis of faith where what I was raised in was no longer adequate. I looked at it and it kind of came apart, and I was still trying to put the pieces together. While in theology school, I heard what I call a whisper call to the church's ministry. That whisper kept fading in and out. I finally said, okay, this seems to be what I should try to do. And I remember driving the U-Haul truck from Atlanta, where I went to school at Emory, to my first church in Memphis, carrying on this conversation with God that went something like, this seems to be what I'm supposed to be doing right now, but you need to know what you're getting. And I guess since you're God, you know what you're getting, and what you're getting is someone that doesn't look anything like a minister or a pastor. I've still got all these questions, and church people want you to have all the answers, and I don't have the answers, and I'm not going to pretend I do. And I kind of entered this bargain. God, this is an experiment, and if we discover it doesn't work, I'm out of here. Well, the experiment lasted 40 years. 40 years. And there were times when I wanted to get out of here, it's that kind of thing. When I look back on the kind of pastor minister I was, I know I was shaped by certain experiences that oriented me a certain way, gave me certain sensitivities and empathies and understandings that helped me do what I felt like I was called to do. Can you talk some about what went into making you and equipping you to be a pastor?
So when I first started exploring going into ministry and what that looked like, at that point in my life, I'd really never had any trials, tribulations, difficulties. My parents were still married. I had a pretty good childhood growing up. We weren't rich or loaded, but they provided for me to do things I wanted to do, and I didn't go without. But when my wife and I found out we were having our first kid, it was into the pregnancy that we discovered something was wrong in the womb with the baby. And it was really kind of this big, scary, like, we don't know. We had to wait 2 weeks to see a specialist. They said there was a mass in his stomach, and we didn't know what that mass was, and we had to wait to see that specialist. And when we saw the specialist, they told us that he had a bad kidney, and that kidney was filled with cysts all over it, and it was swelling up, and it was taking over his abdomen. And we were told that when he's born, they just need to get that bad kidney out, and he'll be fine. He can live a normal life. And this was the first time ever in either of our lives that we had faced any kind of adversity, afflictions, like a real kind, where it was like, God, what's going to happen here? Kind of, God, what are you going to do? What should we expect? How should we be praying about this? Just like, Lord, fix it kind of thing, just genie in the bottle this thing away. Here's our wish, make it all better. And I didn't really have a framework for how to think about suffering. And it was on March the 8th, 2004 that he was born at 30 weeks. It was 10 weeks premature. And some complications, obviously, because he was early, but for the most part, doing okay. And the plan was that they had to get that bad kidney out. And so they tried to let him get bigger, grow a little bit before they took him into surgery. And when he was 2 months old, they decided to go ahead and do it. It was kind of a risk-reward thing going on. He was getting infections from that kidney being in there. And those infections were making him super sick to the point of even like we could lose him. So they were like, at this point, the risk of not doing it is greater than the risk of doing the surgery. So they did the surgery, they took out the bad kidney, and we were told that day, like, hey, all he has to do is urinate, and you can go home, and everything's going to look like normal life for you. He can live with one kidney, he'll never know the difference, everything will be, just like a normal child. And what ended up happening is the next day he still hadn't peed, and his blood pressure was skyrocketing, his heart rate was skyrocketing, his body weight was swelling, and they did ultrasounds and tests to discover that they had made a mistake in the surgery, and that they not only took his bad kidney out, but they took his good kidney out with it. And as you can imagine, for us, that was earth-shattering. It threw our world upside down. And I didn't know much about human anatomy at 23 years old, as much as you would think you should know at that age, but I didn't realize, like, you can't live without a kidney, right? It's not something you can just go on without. And I learned really quickly this was a game changer for us. And we met with doctors that night. They said, you've got to make a decision. You've either got to try some things that we've never tried on a child this size, dialysis, try to get a kidney transplant. It'll be a while because he's going to have to get bigger. You have to get an adult kidney. You can't get a kid kidney. So there's a lot of things that will have to happen that we've never done. Or do nothing. And of course, do nothing meant let your son die. And so we decided to try to do the things they had never tried before. And they did. And for 2 years, we did those things, and they worked, but it was a lot of strain on his body, a lot of surgeries, a lot of catheters, a lot of trips to Nashville for dialysis. And what ended up happening was he was 2 years old, he got a kidney transplant. And it was during that 2 years that I realized that we had no theology, if you want to call it that, no theology of suffering. We had no compartment for thinking through suffering and where is God and how do we make sense of this. And I was 23 years old and read the Bible, but because I'd never had suffering, there's certain things I didn't look at very closely or in the Bible. There's things I didn't grapple with because my own life experience didn't force me to. And now here we were thrown into the fire, for lack of better words, trying to grab what we could understand. And at the same time, this was all going on is when we were starting the church. And so the whole time, I've pastored really kind of with this heavy sense of afflictions with people and mercy and compassion and helping people go through suffering and being able to relate to them. And I think it was honestly, as crazy as it sounds, a gift from God, because how much relating to a 60-year-old can a 24-year-old, 5-year-old pastor do? But because I had experienced hurt and suffering, and I was having to trust God daily with things that I didn't control and I didn't understand, I could at least relate on some levels on pain and when troubles come. So from 2 years old to 13 years old, my son, I want to say, lived a normal life, more normal than his first 2 years and more normal than his last 2 years. For 11 years, he went to school, played video games, hung out with his friends. He had a lot of things going on because he had a kidney transplant. He was on medicine that kept his body from rejecting the kidney, but it also made his body more susceptible to infections and sickness. And so we were in and out of the hospital a lot, lots of surgeries, lots of things, more things than time to get into. But for us, it was as normal life can get. And a lot of things we enjoyed doing. I did all kinds of things that anybody else would do with their son. Helped coach his t-ball team. We went ice skating. We went to Preds games. We went to Tennessee Vols games, which were always terrible. But we did all those things. And if you wouldn't have known the story, I'm with you. Look, I'm with you. If you didn't know any better, if you didn't know his story, or if he didn't take his shirt off where you could see all the scars, you wouldn't know any difference between him and the person next to him. But when he was 13 years old, in 2017, he had a stroke. He ended up having something called fungal meningitis. And we don't know how he got it, but his body didn't fight it off. It couldn't fight it off. And he ended up having a stroke. From that stroke, he lost all of his motor skills and his ability to talk and move his arms and his fingers and his everything. And for 3 weeks, he was unconscious. We were in the hospital for over 90 days. He ended up going to Atlanta for an inpatient rehab facility. And there he began to regain a lot of mobile movement, even though not fully, not even close to fully. But he did not regain his speech. He could communicate with us through other creative ways. We'd say, if you want this, blink your eyes twice, or give me a 1 if you want to watch the Preds game, or whatever. And he could communicate that way, but there was no talking the way it used to be. And you got to think, for a kid his age, that's a drastic life change. To go from gaming online with your friends, playing 2K and screaming, over the internet, going to school every day, to you can't lift your head up, you can't even grasp a controller with your fingers, and you can't talk. My son had a ton of faith. And the reason that he had a ton of faith is from the time he was born, even until those moments, we had been talking with him about suffering and trials and afflictions because we knew his life would be marked by them. And we were teaching to him the things we were having to grapple with ourselves as parents. Because even though it wasn't me having a stroke or me having a kidney removed by accident, or me doing dialysis, or me infected with, problems in the hospital. It was still us trying to make sense of it, suffering with him, loving our boy. And so all these were questions and experiences that started to shape our theology, right? Our view and understanding of God and his ways in this world. And obviously we didn't detach that from the scriptures. We wanted the Bible to inform our experience, not our experiences inform our beliefs. But our experiences certainly made it palatable, real, tangible. We had to have answers. We needed real hope for what do we do with this. From the fall of 2017 until December 1st, 2019, it was kind of an ongoing battle with the complications from that stroke and pain from neurological issues. And in December 1st, 2019, my son passed away. He was 15 years old. And, we knew that could be something that would happen one day. In fact, I was prepared, even from the time he was a kid, that I might bury my son before they bury me. I knew it was a real possibility because of his circumstances, because I knew the implications of what had happened. But you can anticipate it and imagine it, but it's different than going through it, right? You can imagine the pain, the hurt, the loss, but going through it is a whole different experience. And while we were prepared, you're never ready. And saying goodbye to him was incredibly difficult. I have 2 daughters as well, and watching them say goodbye to their little brother. And there's just so many things that you're going through emotionally and, in your head and in your mind. And so this has been a part of my life. It went from really no suffering, really, in my life to really what will be for the rest of my life, some form of grief or pain or mourning or loss because of sin and brokenness in the world. And there's been so many things that God's taught us through this, learning to forgive. I mean, we had to learn to forgive that doctor who did that surgery. I mean, we hated him for a period of time. And I'm a pastor preaching love your enemies and hated this man. Right? Real resentment, real bitterness that I then had to work through to say, okay, Lord, you have forgiven me of infinitely more, but how do I forgive this guy who took everything from us? And we started working through that. We started to maneuver and navigate our hearts around what that meant. And it didn't mean forgetting that it happened. It didn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It didn't mean we had to go be best friends with him and have cookouts with him as a result. But it did mean we had to detach ourselves from his mistake, from our emotional health. We couldn't let his mistake guide our emotions. We could not let him and what he had done be the center of our lives. And so we got to a place where we forgave him as a family. We didn't have to go talk to him about that. We could forgive him without him ever knowing it. We could forgive him without him even wanting it. That was a big lesson we had to learn. But by the grace of God and the providence of God, I actually had a chance to run into him and tell him we forgave him. And this man that I had created into a monster actually broke down crying and said he was just so sorry for everything that had happened. And in that moment, I got to see a little glimpse of the power of forgiveness. And that's just one little sliver. That's just one little sliver of lessons along the way that the Lord has not only taught us, but formed in us. I'm not the same person. I'm not the same person that I would have been without these things. Without suffering and pain, I wouldn't be the man I am. I wouldn't be the husband or the father that I am to my girls. I wouldn't be the pastor that I am to our people. And it's not that I would volunteer to go through it all over again. Because if it was me writing the script, I would never want pain. I'd never want afflictions. I'd never want any adversity. I'd want my life to be glassy sea. And I think we've got a version of Christianity out there that thinks, or at least preaches, that, if you love God, everything will be glassy sea. And he burst my bubble with that really fast. He burst it really fast. And I had to learn instead what it looks like to trust God, even when I don't understand why God allows or does what he does. I had to come to this really humbling reminder that I'm not God. And that may sound so simplistic, like you're looking at me and you're like, yeah, I know you're not God, because I can see a lot of reasons why you wouldn't be God. But coming to a place where in your heart you can say, I'm not God. And so I have to trust the one who is. Who am I to put God on the witness stand to testify before me, before my prosecuting questions? And he can handle our questions, there's no doubt. And sometimes we have to get those questions out in order to learn and grow. But I had to come to a place where I realized, like Job did, I need to cover my mouth because I don't know what I'm talking about. And so I'm going to trust you. And I would love to say that learning to trust God was something that was like a light switch. You just kind of turn on and it's like, there we go, I'm just going to trust him today. Just easy peasy. But it wasn't. It's a process of learning and growing and falling. And so that would be, I would say, the most significant. I went to seminary, got a master's, I've done doctorate work. None of those things has been as educational as pain and suffering in my ministry. And so, yeah, that's a snapshot. Yeah.
Everyone that's come in and I just off and on, I go to the Journey Church, and so this is going to kind of tee it up a little bit. One of the things, a lot of people come in and they're part of something on the billboard that says Methodist or Catholic or whatever, and now you're the one that came in, you're the Journey Church. What does it mean in the Journey Church theologically? What are the groundings, and when people walk in, what is the experience they have at the Journey Church?
So, we're a Bible-believing church, so our whole thing is that we want to take our cues from what the Bible teaches. But when our church is not, our church wants to make Jesus the big deal. One of the things we say all the time is his name is the most important name on the marquee. It's not about the pastor. It's not about any one person. There's no big dealness allowed at our church. It's about Jesus. He's the only one that's going to get the shine. He's the only one that's going to get the acclaim. And so that's a big thing that we preach. But we really emphasize relationship with God. We really emphasize not a bunch of, beliefs and behaviors matter. But when I was growing up, that was the only thing I really thought church was about. Believe and behave. Believe this, believe that, believe this, believe that, believe this, believe this. Here's your list. Assent intellectually, agree to them, and then behave. Do this, do this, do this. Don't do this, don't do. Most of it was actually don't do this, don't do, don't do, don't do. And then there's a few, if you're super Christian, do this, do this, do this. And so my whole upbringing was believe and behave, believe and behave. And I had never been told. I was in my 20s before I realized, actually the whole thread of the Bible is communion with God, fellowship with God. We were made for relationship with God. Sin severs our relationship with God. Christ restores relationship with God. And eternity forever is about relationship with God, fellowship with him. And so your beliefs matter and your behaviors matter, but they're not the central thing. And so we don't make them the central thing. We make relationship with Christ the central thing. We make recognizing what Christ has done is the most important thing. So our mission statement, we say this all the time, is to show Jesus as incomparably glorious, unrivaled, unmatched, no competitors, that Jesus is it. And if you see him rightly, your life will never be the same. That if you see him rightly, not with Bible Belt lenses, not with whatever, to see him as he is changes you. And to live with Jesus at the center of your life is the best life you can live. Doesn't mean it'll be the easiest, as I've just described. Doesn't mean it'll be pain-free, but we do believe it's the one that's most joyful and filled with meaning and purpose. And so we're all about making disciples of Jesus. That's what we do. And that means people of every nation, tribe, tongue, race, ethnicity, background. We say all are welcome, but the centerpiece is Jesus.
Erik, what was your son's name?
Caleb.
I don't know if you remember. You brought Caleb
I did.
to a chapel chat.
Yep. Right before quarantine.
Two of our international students,
Yep.
sisters,
Yep.
runners from Africa, were speaking that day. And I remember you all sat over there, and I met Caleb in his wheelchair
Yep.
that day.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that story. And also for, at least because I tend to agree with you, sort of offering an alternative to what I've grew up with was one understanding of faith, church, Christianity that I had to work through in order to reclaim it because it didn't seem to jive with Jesus. Our young people, well, everybody, but especially our young people, our college students. I can only imagine what it must be like to be in their shoes at this point in their life, given what's going on. I was about to say, with all hell breaking loose, but occasionally heaven breaks loose too. How do you help? What would you want to say to these young people to help them navigate this particular point in their life with this whirlwind of uncertainty and unpredictability and challenge? Challenge is a tactful way to put it. Go ahead.
I think going back to what I was even just talking about with the church, I think relationship with the Lord personally is key. Not just belief in God, but relationship with the Lord. And if that's foreign, like it was to me at one point, I think it's vital that you explore what does that mean? What does that look like? But here's why I say that. You're all going to go through trials and tribulations at some point. If you haven't already, some of you have. Maybe it's divorced parents, maybe it's physical, emotional, sexual abuse that happened to you when you were younger. Maybe it's losing a sibling. Maybe it's, you just go down the list. I'm sure it's represented here easily. And if you haven't, you will. If you haven't, you will. You're going to get a call one day, and your world's going to get turned upside down. That's what happens in life. And the question is going to be, are you prepared for that? And there's no preparing in terms of making it where it's easy and doesn't hurt. What I mean by preparing is do you have the foundations for walking through hardships? Do you have an understanding of who God is in relationship to suffering? This was a big question I had to work through. How do I make sense of God and suffering in this world? And that's not something that you can just, like that. You got to work through that. And it's not just theological, it's philosophical, and there's all kinds of things you got to work through. But you got to work through it because this life is not cupcakes and rainbows. And you're going to get hurt. And if you're not careful, here's what we tend to do when it happens, because we don't expect it. We tend to then blame God. Where were you? Why did you? How could you? And so that reveals where our theology is already. Even if we didn't attempt to put one together, we had one. And it just came out when we said, how could you, God? Where would you? And what that revealed is we thought God's primary job was to prevent those things for us. And when he didn't, we feel like he failed us. So you may have one and don't realize you have a theology of suffering. But you gotta check that. You gotta ask, where am I in that? The second thing is that relationship with God has to be sought after and real to you. This is what the Bible says. Isaiah 41:10. God says, fear not, I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. That's Isaiah 41:10. When the Apostle Paul was going through suffering and trials, he never once asked for God to take him away until this one particular thing in his life. He went through all kinds of things. He was shipwrecked, hungry, naked, cold, homeless, whipped to death almost, and never once said, God, why did you? How could you prevent it? Don't let it happen again. Never said it one time. And yet there was something going on in his life. He called a thorn in his flesh in 2 Corinthians 12 that he actually did 3 times ask the Lord to take away. And you would think the Lord would be like, hey, for you, Paul, I got you. Because you've been through so much, I'm going to take this away from you. And you know what Jesus said to him? I will never forget these words because I need them too. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, he doesn't say, Paul, I'm going to take this away. He says, Paul, I'll be enough for you. I'll be enough to sustain you, to hold you, to keep you as you go through it. When you think about Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace, notice they weren't immediately removed. Instead, the 4th figure was in the fire. The Lord was with them in the fire. this is the whole thing I think we have to understand is suffering will come, but the thing is you're never alone. You're not, God doesn't abandon you in your pain. He's to be sought after. And sometimes it's actually in that pain he becomes most visible and real and present to you. But you've got to learn to walk with God as opposed to accuse God. And so my thing would be to say, get your foundations about suffering and this world and how to make sense of it theologically. 2, pursue your relationship with God. And then 3, I would say this, don't try to go at it alone. You need community. You need others. You need people to lean on. When you're weak, when you're struggling to hang on to promises, you need people who will preach them to your heart for you. We had people, I'm a preacher, but we've had people all along the way who held up our arms when we had no strength left, who kept preaching to us. Remember these things, remember these things, remember these things. And you need that too. So don't try to go at it alone. Seek your relationship with God and get down to those foundational things of how do you make sense of God and suffering in this world.
When I was a college student, I thought I could use my mind to get me wherever I wanted to go and to accomplish whatever I wanted to accomplish. And it was only when I hit the dead end and realized I needed something else, needed something more. We talk about it, spirit, soul, heart, in addition to the mind. One of those places, and you've mentioned it already, where I had to admit my own limitations as a human being, has been at the point of forgiveness.
Yeah.
I'm convinced forgiveness is a miracle, that we can't do it on our own. We're not good enough to forgive another person for their... So can you talk, I know you talked about the doctor, can you talk a little bit more about that process of coming to forgiveness?
Yeah. I think it's important to realize the danger of not forgiving first. Not forgiving people who have hurt you is enslavement, it's bondage, it will wreck you. It will wreck you if you let it continue to persist, because it festers and it grows into bitterness and resentment. When held on to, a lack of forgiveness will make you miserable. Because we think that by not forgiving, we're holding on to some power, we're maintaining control over what that person did, when in reality, it's the opposite. They're controlling us. They're outliving their life in control of us because of something they've done that we can't seem to get past. And that's not free at all. It's not freeing at all. So my whole thing is to first begin with understanding how dangerous it is to not forgive. Second, realize that forgiveness is, it's not something that you can trust. It's not a light switch you can just flip on and off. Okay, I'm going to forgive. You got to work through that stuff in your heart. You got to work through, what is it that you're not forgiving? Why, what hurt was caused? What hurt was created? The third thing, I think, and I'm going to dive into the mechanics just a little bit, but the third thing is you've got to understand what forgiveness is not. A lot of times when people think you got to forgive somebody, it means you've got to become best friends with them again. Right? If somebody hurts you and then somebody tells you, you need to forgive them, in your mind, if you're not careful, you'll fill that blank in with, they're saying, I got to act like what they didn't happen. Right? I'll give you an example of this. The person that was sexually assaulted can forgive their assaulter without ever seeing, being with, hanging out, or excusing what the person did. You catch where I'm going? Forgiving has nothing to do with saying what they did was okay. Forgiving is not justifying them. Forgiving is not justifying them. I think if we entangle those two things together, we're going to not want to forgive, because our forgiveness is tied to saying what you did's okay, and it's not okay. So first off, you got to work through some of those things. That's huge. Here's for me what allowed us, and it took about a year to get to a place where we could forgive that doctor. The Bible says, Jesus, first off, tells us to forgive as we've been forgiven. And then there's a story he tells in Matthew 18. Peter, one of his disciples, asked Jesus, he said, how many times should we forgive our brother that sins against us? 7 times? He thought, like, well, that's a big number. Like, if you forgive somebody 7 times, that's huge. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. Now, if you're a math major, don't do the math. He's not giving you the cap of where you stop forgiving. He's saying, no, you forgive, you always forgive. So that forces us to be like, ooh, okay, so what does it mean then? Do you just say, okay, I forgive you, and then you hurt me again? I go, okay, I forgive you, and then you hurt me again. No. But when they asked for an understanding of it, Jesus told a parable, and this is what he said. If a certain money lender gave out money to one person, and they couldn't pay him back, and they asked for forgiveness, and he forgives the man, but then the man, forgiven much, turns around and goes to somebody who owes him money, less money, way less money, and says, give me what you owe me or I'm throwing you in prison. And the guy's like, I can't pay you, please forgive my debt. And he's like, no, I'm not forgiving you. I'm throwing you into prison for every dime you owe me. He says, what do you think that person who forgave that man's debt would do? He would want to call him to account for the debt he paid, right? If I forgave you a huge debt and then you turned around and made somebody else pay one that was way less, Jesus says, that's what your Father will do to you if you don't forgive as you've been forgiven. In other words, Jesus says this, if I have forgiven you of an infinite amount of sin, and then you can't forgive one person who sinned against you, have you really even experienced forgiveness for your sin? That's the issue. And so I started working through, Jesus, even in the Lord's Prayer, talks about forgive as you've been forgiven. If you don't forgive as you've been forgiven, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you. Okay, that scares me. That's one of the things. It scared me when I realized I hated this doctor and I did not forgive him and read Jesus say, if you don't forgive as I forgave you, then you won't be forgiven. I'm like, I don't want any of that. I don't want to not be forgiven. I got way too much that needs forgiven to forfeit that. So what do? How do you get to a place where you can forgive someone that hurts you? This is the best way I can explain. This is the best way for me that I've learned to do this. Forgiveness horizontally begins vertically. If you're going to forgive someone out here who's hurt you, it doesn't begin with their deserving forgiveness. It doesn't begin with their wanting forgiveness. It doesn't begin with their being worthy of forgiveness. It has nothing to do with them horizontally. It begins vertically. And here's what I mean by that. In order for me to forgive you, I have to keep going, Lord, look how much you have forgiven me. Lord, you have forgiven me infinitely more than I'm being asked to forgive him. In other words, the more I remind myself of how much I've been forgiven, here's what started to happen. We began to become more grateful and more mindful of how much God had forgiven us, that it made it easier to look at him and say, we can forgive you. And it doesn't happen overnight. It requires a heart change. It requires really getting acquainted with my own forgiveness, right? It starts vertically before it goes horizontally. That's been the best thing that I've ever learned about forgiveness is I can't forgive except for on the basis of my own forgiveness. If I've tasted real forgiveness, then I should be somebody who can give real forgiveness. If I haven't tasted real forgiveness, I'm going to struggle to forgive others because I don't even realize and grasp how much I've been forgiven. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy. And I'll leave this lesson. Forgiveness is not a one-time thing. It's ongoing. And here's what I mean by that. It was within 2 years I forgave. Our family had gotten our hearts to a place where we really forgave that doctor. Had that meeting in the hallway with him, the whole thing. That's now been 13 plus years since that happened. 14. And since that time, my son has had a stroke and my son has died. I've had to comfort and console my daughters on days where they're hurting. When we go to visit his gravesite on special days, his birthday was just on Monday. It had been 17. Okay? If I'm not careful, here's what can happen. My mind can easily trigger all of those feelings of bitterness and resentment all over again. All I've got to do is think about what we're not experiencing, what's been taken from us. All I have to do is let my mind go there just for a few seconds, and you know what can happen? all of that anger and hatred for that doctor, because it all stems back to that moment. And if I'm not careful, I can hate him all over again. So forgiveness is not a one-time event. What I have learned is that forgiveness is an ongoing thing. I have to keep choosing to forgive. I have to keep choosing to forgive, which means a lot of times I have to take thoughts captive, as the Bible talks about, and say, we're not going down that road. When I start letting my mind go down this road of what could have been, what should have been, and I have to go back to my theology of suffering. No, God, you're in control. You have my son's life in your hands. I got to do a lot of stuff up here in order not to let my heart get out of bounds here. So that's the best way I can describe it in that amount of time.
I have found it's also a struggle to forgive myself, to receive forgiveness.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's often the hardest one.
Because I have this long list of what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
I think that's why we need to encourage and be affirming of each other, because it's so easy for us to doubt that.
Yeah.
Because the world has a voice that keeps telling us how inadequate we are. I hope that if you've gotten anything from Erik's witness testimony, it's that wherever we are and trying to figure out what we believe, what we think, how we're going to live, what our values are, it begins with being honest, brutally honest. Early on, I heard this voice say to me, and I believed it, that God wants us in our truth. And we don't have to pretend that our doubts, our questions, are our doubts and questions, or that our anger, our resentment, our bitter, it's who we are. And if we don't stop there, we can't move on to anything. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm willing, if anybody
with us.
has any questions that you'd like to talk about further, if you want to email me, you can go to our church's website. It's tjclive.com. You can go to our page, our staff page, click on my email. And if you ever want to talk more about some of these things or questions that it pops up, I'd be happy to answer any of those questions or point you to some resources that can.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and being a part of this.
Yeah, thanks, guys.